The morning sun cast long shadows across the Montana prairie as Aiyana adjusted the leather pouch containing her grandmother's beadwork. The intricate patterns of blue and white beads caught the early light, each piece telling a story of her people's traditions. At 16, she had inherited not only her grandmother's skilled hands, but also the responsibility of trading these precious works to ensure her family's survival through the harsh winter ahead. Her painted pony, Maka, stepped carefully through the frost-covered grass, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp October air. Aiyana pulled her elk-hide coat tighter around her shoulders, feeling the weight of the moment. This would be her first time trading alone in Copper Creek, a responsibility her father, Chief Running Bear, had reluctantly granted after months of her persistent requests. "Remember, my daughter," he had said the night before, his weathered hands resting on her shoulders, "the white man's town is not like our village. Their hearts are often closed to our ways. Speak little, trade quickly, and return before the sun reaches the western hills." The 2-hour ride gave Aiyana time to practice the English words she had learned from Thomas Whitmore, the kind trader who occasionally visited their camp. Unlike the other whites, Thomas had shown genuine interest in learning about Lakota customs, even attempting to speak their language. He had taught her the names of common trade goods and simple phrases that might help her navigate the transaction. As Copper Creek came into view, Aiyana felt her stomach tighten. The town sprawled across a valley like a scar on the earth, its wooden buildings looking harsh and angular compared to the flowing teepees of her village. Smoke rose from various chimneys, and she could hear the sounds of hammering, shouting, and the occasional crack of a whip as freight wagons moved through the muddy streets. The town had grown rapidly since gold was discovered in the nearby hills 2 years ago. What had once been a small trading post was now home to nearly 400 people, most of whom had never lived alongside Native Americans and carried with them the fears and prejudices of the East. Aiyana guided Maka down the main street, acutely aware of the stares following her movement. Women in long dresses and bonnets paused their conversations to watch her pass, their expressions ranging from curiosity to barely concealed hostility. Men loading supplies onto wagons stopped their work, some spitting tobacco juice into the dust as she rode by. She had visited the town twice before, but always with her brother Takoda or her father. Their presence had provided protection and confidence. Now alone among these strangers, she felt the full weight of being different in a place where difference was often met with suspicion. Mitchell's General Store stood at the corner of Main and Pine Streets, its painted sign weathered but still readable. Samuel Mitchell had always been fair in his dealings with her people, never trying to cheat them or charge excessive prices for basic necessities. Her father had told her that Sam was one of the few whites who looked at them as people rather than obstacles to progress. As she dismounted and tied Maka to the hitching post, Aiyana noticed a group of men gathered outside Murphy's saloon across the street. Their voices carried clearly in the morning air, rough and loud from an early start on whiskey. "Look what the wind blew in," one of them called out, his words slurred but his meaning clear. "Little Indian princess come to town." Aiyana kept her eyes forward, her grandmother's teachings echoing in her mind. Dignity is a shield that cannot be broken by the words of small men. She pushed open the door to Mitchell's store, the bell above announcing her arrival. Samuel Mitchell looked up from behind the counter, his kind eyes immediately recognizing her. "Morning, Aiyana. How's your father?" "He is well, Mr. Mitchell. I have brought my grandmother's beadwork to trade." She carefully removed the leather pouch from her coat, placing it gently on the wooden counter. Sam examined each piece with genuine appreciation, his fingers tracing the intricate patterns. "These are beautiful. Your grandmother was truly gifted. What do you need in exchange?" "Flour, salt and ammunition for my father's rifle. Also, if possible, a wool blanket for the winter." As they conducted their business, Aiyana felt a momentary sense of normalcy. Here was proof that understanding between their peoples was possible. But outside, the voices from the saloon were growing louder, and she could see more men gathering in the street. The transaction complete, Sam handed her the supplies. "Aiyana, might I suggest you consider taking the back road home today? Some of the men have been drinking since dawn, and they're not in the best of moods." She nodded gratefully, but as she stepped outside, she realized it was too late for caution. Nearly a dozen men had gathered around her pony, their faces flushed with alcohol and something darker. At their center stood Jake Morrison, the saloon owner, his cold eyes fixed on her with undisguised contempt. "Well, well," Jake said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being heard. Looks like we got ourselves a little savage come to town. Tell me, girl, can your kind even speak proper English, or do you just grunt and point like the animals you are? Aiyana felt her heart racing, but she kept her voice steady. I speak English. I only came to trade. Oh, it talks. Jake laughed, and several men joined in. But I bet you can't sing like a civilized person. I bet all you know are them heathen war chants. The mockery in his voice cut deep, touching something sacred within her. Without thinking, Aiyana felt her grandmother's spirit calling to her, and she knew what she must do. The words hung in the air like smoke from a dying fire. Aiyana felt the weight of her grandmother's memory pressing against her heart, and suddenly the jeering faces before her seemed to fade into the background. In that moment she was transported back to the sacred circle of her people, where songs were not entertainment but prayers, where music carried the spirits of the ancestors. My grandmother taught me the songs of our people, she said quietly, her voice carrying a dignity that made some of the men shift uncomfortably. She sang them when the seasons changed, when babies were born, and when loved ones journeyed to the spirit world. Jake Morrison's eyes narrowed. Nobody asked for a history lesson, girl. I said let's hear you sing something civilized, not your heathen noise. But Aiyana was no longer listening to Jake. 3 days ago, her grandmother had passed during the night, her final breath carrying the scent of sage and the whispered promise that she would watch over her granddaughter always. The funeral songs had been sung, the mourning completed according to tradition, but the grief remained fresh in Aiyana's heart. She closed her eyes and began to sing. The melody that emerged was unlike anything the townspeople had ever heard. It started low and mournful, rising and falling like the wind across the prairie. The words were in Lakota, ancient and sacred, telling of a woman's journey from earth to sky, of love that transcends death, of the eternal connection between the living and those who have gone before. Ina mitakuye oyasin, her voice soared, pure and heartbreaking, carrying across the dusty street and beyond. The song spoke of universal truths, loss, love, the pain of separation, the hope of reunion. Even without understanding the words, several listeners felt something stir within them, a recognition of shared humanity. For a moment, the street fell silent except for Aiyana's voice. Even Jake Morrison seemed momentarily affected, his sneer faltering as the raw emotion in her song touched something he thought he had buried years ago. But the moment passed quickly. What in the hell is that caterwauling? Jake shouted, his voice cracking through the sacred silence like a whip. Sounds like a dying coyote. The spell broken, the other men began to laugh. What had been a moment of transcendent beauty became fuel for their mockery. I heard better music from my hogs, called out Pete Garrison, a pig farmer who had lost his land to drink and blamed everyone but himself. Maybe if we throw some coins she'll stop, added another voice from the growing crowd. But Aiyana continued singing, her voice now carrying not just grief but defiance. This was her grandmother's song, her people's song, and she would not let these men reduce it to a spectacle. Her voice grew stronger, more determined, the melody weaving through the air like a thread connecting her to her ancestors. The crowd had grown to nearly 30 people drawn by the commotion. Some watched in uncomfortable silence, recognizing the cruelty of what was happening but lacking the courage to intervene. Others joined in the laughter, their voices growing louder and more vicious. Listen to her howl, Jake commanded, his face flushed with alcohol and malice. This is what passes for music among the savages. A woman in a blue dress called out from the boardwalk. Someone should tell her this is a civilized town. The mockery escalated. Men began to imitate her song with exaggerated off-key wailing. They stomped their feet in a crude parody of traditional dance, their faces twisted with contempt. Children, following their parents' lead, pointed and giggled. Samuel Mitchell emerged from his store, his face dark with anger. "That's enough," he shouted, but his voice was lost in the growing chaos. Jake Morrison seized the moment, jumping onto a wooden crate to address the crowd like a carnival barker. "Ladies and gentlemen, witness the entertainment of the noble red man. Listen to the beautiful music of our savage neighbors." The crowd roared with laughter and applause. Someone threw a handful of dirt, which scattered harmlessly at Aiyana's feet, but sent a clear message. Another person tossed a bent penny which clinked on the wooden planks of the sidewalk. Through it all, Aiyana continued to sing. Tears ran down her cheeks, but her voice never wavered. The song was her shield, her prayer, her connection to everything sacred in her world. She sang for her grandmother's spirit, for her people's dignity, for the hope that someday understanding might replace hatred. But the crowd's behavior grew increasingly aggressive. Men pressed closer, their voices louder, their gestures more threatening. What had started as crude humor was transforming into something uglier, a mob mentality that fed on itself, growing more dangerous with each passing moment. "Make her stop that noise," someone shouted. "Run her out of town. Show her what we think of Indian music." The circle of men tightened around Aiyana, their faces no longer merely mocking but actively hostile. She could smell the whiskey on their breath, see the hardness in their eyes that spoke of violence barely held in check. Samuel Mitchell pushed through the crowd, his hand resting on the gun at his hip. "I said that's enough, leave her be." But Jake Morrison was drunk on power and alcohol, and he wasn't about to let anyone spoil his entertainment. "Stay out of this, Sam. Nobody asked you to defend these animals." The confrontation between the two men added another layer of tension to an already explosive situation. The crowd sensed the potential for violence, and their excitement grew. Some began to take sides, their voices adding to the chaos. Aiyana's song reached its crescendo, her voice carrying across the prairie beyond the town limits. She sang of courage in the face of hatred, of dignity maintained despite degradation, of the eternal hope that goodness would ultimately triumph over evil. She had no way of knowing that her voice was indeed carrying beyond the town, across the grassland, to where 40 mounted warriors sat their horses on a ridge 2 miles away, their keen hearing catching the familiar melody of mourning that every Lakota knew by heart. The warriors had been tracking stolen horses, following a trail that led toward Copper Creek. They had intended to approach the town cautiously, to investigate quietly and avoid confrontation if possible. But now they heard their chief's daughter singing the death song, her voice filled with pain and humiliation, surrounded by the ugly sounds of white men's laughter and threats. On the ridge, Takoda, Aiyana's older brother and leader of the war party, raised his hand to signal the others. 40 pairs of eyes turned toward the sound, 40 hearts filled with the same cold anger. In the town square, Aiyana's song was coming to an end, but the crowd's appetite for cruelty was just beginning. Jake Morrison jumped down from his crate, his face twisted with an ugliness that went far beyond mere prejudice. "I think we've heard enough Indian music for one day," he said, his voice carrying a threat that made even some of his supporters step back. "Time to teach this little savage some manners." The moment balanced on a knife's edge, violence hanging in the air like the scent of an approaching storm. And then, from the eastern edge of town, came the sound that would change everything, the thunder of hoofbeats growing closer with each passing second. The sound started as a distant rumble, like summer thunder rolling across the Montana sky. But there were no clouds overhead, and the rhythm was too steady, too purposeful. The laughter in the town square began to falter as heads turned toward the eastern road, where a cloud of dust was rising against the morning sun. Jake Morrison was the first to recognize what was coming. His face, flushed with alcohol and malice just moments before, suddenly drained of color. "Jesus Christ," he whispered, his voice barely audible above the growing thunder of hoofbeats. 40 mounted warriors crested the hill overlooking Copper Creek, their silhouettes black against the brightening sky. They rode bareback, their bodies moving as one with their horses, a sight that spoke of generations of horsemanship and warfare. War paint streaked their faces, and eagle feathers caught the morning wind. At their head rode Takoda, Aiyana's brother, his jaw set with cold determination. The transformation in the town square was immediate and dramatic. The jeering crowd that had moments before been pressing closer to Aiyana now stumbled backward, their faces pale with sudden fear. The crude jokes and laughter died in their throats, replaced by the sharp intake of breath and whispered prayers. "Holy Mother of God," breathed Pete Garrison, the pig farmer who had compared Aiyana's singing to his hogs. His hands shook as he reached for the pistol at his belt, only to realize how useless it would be against 40 mounted warriors. Samuel Mitchell stepped protectively in front of Aiyana, his own gun drawn but held low. He had fought in the Civil War, had seen cavalry charges, and knew the devastating power of mounted warriors. These men weren't charging randomly. They moved with the precision of a military unit, their formation designed to surround and overwhelm. "Everyone stay calm," Sam called out, his voice carrying the authority of a former officer. "Don't make any sudden moves. Don't draw your weapons unless I give the word." But panic was already spreading through the crowd like wildfire. Women screamed and ran for the nearest buildings, their long skirts hampering their flight. Children cried as they were swept up by terrified parents. Men who had been so brave when facing one young woman now looked for places to hide. The warriors rode down the main street in perfect formation, their horses' hooves striking the packed earth in a rhythm that seemed to match the frightened heartbeats of the townspeople. They made no war cries, uttered no threats. Their silence was more terrifying than any scream of rage. Takoda raised his hand, and the entire war party came to a halt in a perfect circle around the town square. The warriors sat their horses with stone-faced discipline, their eyes taking in every detail of the scene before them, the scattered coins at their sisters' feet, the dirt that had been thrown, the ugly expressions still lingering on some faces. For a long moment, the only sound was the snorting of horses and the whispered prayers of terrified townspeople. Then Takoda spoke, his voice carrying clearly across the square. Aiyana. His use of her name was gentle, a stark contrast to the steel in his eyes as he surveyed the crowd. "Are you harmed?" She shook her head, though tears still traced paths down her cheeks. "No, brother, they mocked grandmother's song." The words hit the assembled warriors like a physical blow. Several horses shifted restlessly as their riders' hands tightened on their weapons. The death song was sacred, a prayer for the journey of spirits to the next world. To mock it was to desecrate the most holy traditions of their people. Jake Morrison, who had been so loud and confident just minutes before, now stood frozen like a rabbit in the shadow of a hawk. His mouth opened and closed soundlessly, his brain struggling to process the complete reversal of his situation. Mayor Cornelius Hartwell came running from the direction of his office, his round face red with exertion and panic. He had been in his office when the commotion started, and the sight of 40 armed warriors in his town square nearly caused him to collapse. "There's been a misunderstanding," he called out, his voice cracking with fear. "We're peaceful people here, we don't want any trouble." Takoda's gaze shifted to the mayor, and Hartwell felt the weight of those dark eyes like a physical force. "Your people surrounded my sister. They threw dirt at her while she sang the death song for our grandmother. They made her sacred grief into entertainment for their amusement." The mayor's eyes darted around the square, taking in the scattered coins, the ashamed faces of his townspeople, the obvious signs of what had occurred. He had built his political career on the promise of keeping the Indians in their place, but now faced with the reality of 40 armed warriors, his bravado crumbled. We didn't know. That is, we meant no disrespect to your customs," he stammered, his previous confident bigotry replaced by desperate diplomacy. "You meant no disrespect?" Takoda's voice was quiet, but it carried the cold edge of barely controlled rage. "Then why did you gather in a circle around one young woman? Why did you laugh while she honored the dead?" Samuel Mitchell stepped forward, his movements slow and deliberate. "Takoda, I know you remember me. I've always traded fairly with your people. What happened here was wrong, but it was the work of fools, not warriors. Your sister is safe now." Takoda's eyes found Sam's, and there was a moment of recognition. The store owner had indeed always been fair, had never cheated or shown disrespect to the Lakota, but even his words couldn't diminish the insult that had been committed. "You are an honorable man, Samuel Mitchell," Takoda said, "but honor does not erase shame. These people must understand that Lakota dignity is not something to be mocked for their entertainment." The warriors remained motionless, but their very presence was a threat that needed no words. Each man was armed with a rifle, bow, and war club. They had painted their faces and put on their war bonnets not for show, but because they had expected to fight when they heard their chief's daughter's voice carrying pain across the prairie. Dr. William Hayes, the town's physician, and one of its more educated residents, emerged from the crowd. He had traveled widely in his younger years and had some understanding of Plains Indian culture. "Mr. Takoda," he said carefully, "we acknowledge that a grave insult has been committed. What can we do to make amends?" It was a crucial question, and the answer would determine whether the sun would set on a peaceful resolution or on a town stained with blood. The warriors waited, their horses pawing the ground with contained energy. The townspeople held their breath, finally understanding the full magnitude of their folly. Takoda looked down at his sister, who stood with quiet dignity despite the tears on her cheeks. Then his gaze swept over the assembled crowd, reading the fear in their faces, the dawning comprehension of what their cruelty had nearly cost them. "The insult was not to my sister alone," he said finally. "It was to all our people, to our ancestors, to the sacred songs that connect us to the spirit world. These men who laughed and threw dirt, they must understand what they have done." Jake Morrison, who had been the ringleader of the mockery, finally found his voice. "Look, we didn't mean nothing by it. We were just having some fun. Nobody got hurt." The words were perhaps the worst thing he could have said. Several warriors shifted in their saddles, their faces darkening with anger. To dismiss their sister's humiliation as fun was to compound the original insult. Takoda's hand moved to his tomahawk, and the crowd seemed to collectively stop breathing. The moment balanced on a knife's edge, with violence or peace hanging in the balance based on the next word spoken. Fun? Takoda's voice was deadly quiet. You believe mockery of the sacred dead is fun? You believe surrounding a young woman and humiliating her is entertainment? The thunder of hoofbeats had brought the warriors to town, but it was the thunder of consequences that now rolled across the square, as 40 mounted warriors awaited their leader's decision on how to respond to. An insult that could not be ignored. The silence stretched taut as a bowstring, broken only by the restless shifting of horses and the whispered prayers of frightened townspeople. Takoda's hand rested on his tomahawk. 40 warriors awaited his command, and the fate of Copper Creek hung in the balance of his next decision. It was Aiyana who broke the deadly quiet. "Brother," she said softly, her voice carrying the same dignity that had sustained her through the mockery. Grandmother's spirit would not want her death song to bring more death. She taught us that wisdom is stronger than anger, that understanding can grow where hatred has taken root. Takoda's dark eyes never left Jake Morrison's face, but his sister's words seemed to reach him. The hand on his tomahawk relaxed slightly, though the threat remained as real as the morning sun. "Wisdom," he repeated, his voice carrying across the square. "Yes, our grandmother was wise. She taught us that every action has consequences, that respect must be earned and given in equal measure." His gaze swept over the assembled crowd. "She also taught us that some lessons can only be learned through experience." Mayor Hartwell stepped forward, his political instincts finally overcoming his fear. What kind of lesson did you have in mind?" "The same lesson you gave my sister," Takoda replied. "To stand alone before those who do not understand, to have your most sacred beliefs mocked and ridiculed, to feel the weight of hatred from strangers." A murmur of confusion rippled through the crowd. What did he mean? Dr. Hayes, his medical training making him more perceptive to human nature, began to understand. "You want us to experience what she experienced." "Not all of you," Takoda said, his eyes fixing on Jake Morrison. "Only those who led the mockery. Those who found entertainment in sacred grief." Jake's face went from pale to ashen. "What are you talking about?" "You will come with us," Takoda announced, his voice carrying the finality of a judge's gavel. "You will live among our people for one full cycle of the moon. You will learn our ways, understand what you mocked, and perhaps discover that we are not the animals you believe us to be." The suggestion sent a shockwave through the crowd. To the townspeople, being taken by Indians was tantamount to a death sentence. Stories of captivity, real and imagined, had been passed down through generations of settlers. "You can't just take our citizens," Mayor Hartwell protested, his voice rising with panic. "This is still American territory, and this is still Lakota land," Takoda replied calmly. "The papers your government signs do not change the fact that our people have walked these plains for generations beyond counting. But I am not interested in legal arguments. I am interested in justice." Samuel Mitchell stepped forward again, his voice steady despite the tension. "Takoda, I understand your anger, but taking hostages will only bring the cavalry down on your people. There has to be another way." "Hostages?" Takoda's eyebrows rose. "You misunderstand, Samuel Mitchell. I speak of guests. Mr. Morrison will be free to leave at any time, if he can find his way home across 200 miles of prairie, without a horse, food, or knowledge of the land." It was a clever response that technically offered freedom while making the practical reality clear. Jake Morrison would be entirely dependent on Lakota hospitality for his survival. "I ain't going nowhere with you savages," Jake snarled, his fear transforming into desperate defiance. "I'd rather die first." "That can be arranged," said a warrior to Takoda's left, his hand moving to his rifle. The threat was delivered in perfect English, surprising several townspeople who had assumed the warriors couldn't understand their language. Takoda held up a hand to still his warrior, then dismounted from his horse with fluid grace. He walked slowly toward Jake, each step deliberate and measured. The crowd parted before him like water, no one willing to stand in his path. "You mock what you do not understand," Takoda said, stopping just arm's length from the terrified saloon owner. "You laugh at our songs, our customs, our beliefs, but you have never tried to learn what they mean. You see only what you expect to see. Savagery, ignorance, something less than human. Because that's what you are," Jake shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You're nothing but painted devils who—" The words were cut off as Takoda moved with lightning speed, his hand grasping Jake's throat just firmly enough to stop his speech without cutting off his air. The two men stood face to face, one representing generations of prejudice and fear, the other embodying the dignity and strength of a proud people. "You will learn," Takoda said quietly, his voice carrying more menace than any shout. "You will learn that we are men like you, with loves and losses, hopes and fears. You will learn that our songs carry the same pain and joy that fills your own heart. And perhaps, when the moon has completed its cycle, you will understand why your mockery was not just cruel but ignorant." He released Jake, who stumbled backward, gasping and clutching his throat. The saloon owner's eyes darted around the square, looking for support, for someone to stand with him against this ultimatum. "Jake!" The voice came from an unexpected source, Martha Kellerman, the preacher's wife, who had been among those watching the spectacle. "You brought this on yourself, and on all of us." Her words carried the weight of moral authority, and other voices began to join hers. The tide of public opinion was turning as people realized that their neighbor's cruelty had nearly brought disaster on the entire town. "She's right," called out Thomas Brennan, the blacksmith. "We all saw what you did, Jake. The way you riled up the crowd made that poor girl into a target." "I was just having fun," Jake protested, but his words rang hollow in the face of 40 armed warriors and a town that was rapidly abandoning him. Dr. Hayes approached Takoda with careful, respectful steps. "If Mr. Morrison agrees to this arrangement, what assurance do we have that he'll be treated fairly, that he'll be returned unharmed?" "The same assurance my sister had when she came to your town this morning," Takoda replied. "The hope that human decency would prevail over cruelty." The parallel was stark and undeniable. Aiyana had come in peace, seeking only to trade, and had been met with mockery and humiliation. Now Jake Morrison was being asked to trust in the same basic humanity that his actions had violated. "I'll go with you." The voice was so quiet that several people weren't sure they had heard correctly. Jake Morrison stood swaying slightly, his face pale, but his jaw set with a determination born of desperation rather than courage. "But I want your word that you won't torture me or do those things Indians do to prisoners." Takoda's expression didn't change, but several of his warriors exchanged glances. The ignorance and prejudice in Jake's words were almost breathtaking, but they also revealed the depth of misunderstanding that needed to be addressed. "You will be treated as you treated my sister," Takoda said, "with the same respect, the same dignity, the same courtesy you showed her today." The implication was clear, and Jake's face crumpled as he realized what he had brought upon himself. He had shown no respect, no dignity, no courtesy, only cruelty and mockery. "Please," he whispered, his defiance finally cracking. "I got a business to run, people depending on me. Can't we just say we're sorry and call it even?" "Sorry?" Takoda's voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. "You wish to apologize? Very well. Apologize to my sister. Tell her you understand the sacred nature of what you mocked. Convince her that your sorrow is genuine, and perhaps the lesson can be learned here and now." All eyes turned to Jake Morrison, who found himself facing the same young woman he had tormented just minutes before. But now, she was no longer alone and defenseless. She stood in the shadow of 40 warriors, her dignity intact, despite the tears that had dried on her cheeks. The moment stretched out heavy with possibility. Could genuine remorse bridge the gap between cultures? Could understanding grow from the ashes of cruelty, or would pride and prejudice make reconciliation impossible? Jake Morrison opened his mouth to speak, and the entire town held its breath, waiting to see if his words would bring peace or condemn him to a fate he had never imagined. Jake Morrison stood in the center of the square, 40 pairs of eyes watching his every move, the weight of his own words and actions pressing down upon him like a physical burden. His mouth opened and closed several times, but no sound emerged. The easy cruelty that had come so naturally when faced with one defenseless girl now seemed impossible under the steady gaze of her protectors. He began, then stopped, his voice catching in his throat. For the first time in his adult life, Jake Morrison was being forced to confront the real consequences of his hatred. Aiyana stepped forward, her movement graceful despite the emotional turmoil of the morning. "You called my grandmother's death song the howling of animals," she said quietly. "You made my grief into entertainment for your friends. You threw dirt at my feet while I honored the woman who taught me to weave, to sing, to find strength in sorrow." Her words were not accusatory, but simply factual, which somehow made them cut deeper than any angry condemnation. Jake found himself looking into her eyes, really looking for the first time, and seeing not a savage or an animal, but a young woman whose pain was as real and deep as any he had ever known. "She was your grandmother," he whispered, the words seeming to come from somewhere deep inside him. She was a person, a real person who mattered to you." "She was," Aiyana confirmed. "Her name was Winona. She had 67 summers. She survived the winter when the buffalo disappeared. She buried 3 children who died of the white man's diseases, and she taught me that hatred is a poison that kills the one who carries it more than the one it's aimed at." The words hit Jake like physical blows. He had never thought about the individuals behind his prejudice, had never considered that the savages he despised had names, families, losses and loves just as profound as his own. "I didn't know," he said, his voice barely audible. "I didn't think—" "You didn't think we were human," Takoda said, his voice carrying no anger now, only sadness. "You saw only what you expected to see. But ignorance is not an excuse for cruelty, Doctor." Hayes, who had been watching the exchange with growing understanding, stepped forward. "Jake, do you remember when your own mother passed? How you sat by her bedside and sang that old hymn she taught you? Amazing Grace, I believe it was." Jake nodded, confused by the question but unable to deny the memory. "What would you have done if someone had mocked that song? If they had laughed at your grief and called your mother's hymn the howling of animals?" The parallel struck Jake like a lightning bolt. He could imagine his own rage, his own pain, if someone had desecrated his mother's memory in such a way. For the first time he began to understand what he had done to Aiyana. "I would have killed them," he whispered, the admission torn from his soul. "I would have killed anyone who mocked my mother's memory." "And yet you expect us to show more restraint than you would have shown," Takoda observed. "You expect us to accept with grace what you would have answered with violence." The truth of it was undeniable. Jake Morrison had been shown mercy beyond anything he would have offered in return. The warriors could have ridden into town and taken their revenge without a word of explanation. Instead, they had chosen to seek understanding. "I'm sorry," Jake said, the words coming in a rush now. "I'm sorry for what I said, for what I did. I was drunk and stupid and I was wrong, dead wrong." But even as he spoke, Aiyana shook her head sadly. "You're sorry you were caught. You're sorry you're facing consequences. But do you truly understand what you did wrong?" It was a question that cut to the heart of the matter. Was Jake Morrison's remorse genuine, or was it simply fear dressed up as repentance? Jake struggled with the question, his face working through emotions he had never been forced to confront. "I mocked something sacred to you. I made your pain into a joke. I treated you like you weren't a real person with real feelings." "And why did you do that?" Aiyana pressed gently. "Because I thought you were different from me. Because I thought you were less than me." The admission seemed to physically pain him. "Because I've been taught my whole life that Indians are savages, that you don't feel things the way white people do." "And now?" Jake looked around the square, seeing his neighbors' faces, seeing the warriors on their horses, seeing the young woman whose dignity had remained intact despite everything he had done to her. "Now I think maybe I've been wrong about a lot of things." It was not a perfect apology, but it was honest. For the first time, Jake Morrison was questioning the foundations of his prejudice rather than simply regretting its consequences. Takoda dismounted from his horse and walked slowly toward Jake. The saloon owner tensed, expecting violence, but instead found himself facing a man whose expression held curiosity rather than anger. "You say you have been wrong," Takoda said, "but saying it and understanding it are different things. The question is, do you wish to truly understand, or do you wish only to escape the consequences of your ignorance?" It was the crucial moment, the fork in the road that would determine not just Jake Morrison's fate, but the future relationship between the town and the Lakota people. Jake looked at Aiyana, then at Takoda, then at the 40 warriors who had ridden into town to defend their sister's honor. He thought of his own mother, of his own grief, of the hatred that had driven him to such cruelty. "I want to understand," he said finally. "I want to learn. If you'll teach me." The words hung in the air like a prayer, and for a moment, the impossible seemed possible. That understanding might bridge the gap between cultures, that respect might grow where hatred had taken root. Takoda extended his hand to Jake Morrison. "Then you will come with us, not as a prisoner, but as a student. You will learn our ways, our songs, our stories. You will understand what you mocked, and perhaps you will return to your people with wisdom instead of ignorance." Jake looked at the offered hand, knowing that accepting it would change his life forever. Then he thought of Aiyana's dignity in the face of cruelty, of the grace with which she had endured his mockery, of the mercy he was being shown despite deserving none. He took Takoda's hand. The gesture sent a murmur through the crowd, a sound that held both hope and fear. Change was coming to Copper Creek, brought by the thunder of hoofbeats and the courage of a young woman who had refused to let hatred silence her song. Samuel Mitchell stepped forward, his voice carrying clearly across the square. "Takoda, your sister will always be welcome in my store, and when Jake returns, I hope he'll bring with him the understanding that this town sorely needs." "If he returns," Takoda corrected gently. "The choice will be his to make, but he will not return unchanged." As the warriors prepared to depart, Aiyana approached her brother one last time. "The supplies," she said, gesturing toward the bundles Samuel had prepared for her. "Leave them," Takoda said. "Let them be a gift to this town, a reminder that our people come in peace, seeking only respect and understanding." The symbolism was perfect. The supplies that Aiyana had earned through honest trade would remain as a testament to the dignity and generosity of her people, a counterpoint to the cruelty they had faced. As the sun reached its zenith, the war party began to move. Jake Morrison, mounted on a horse provided by Dr. Hayes, rode in the center of the group, his face pale but determined. He had chosen understanding over ignorance, growth over stagnation, and the courage to face his own prejudices. The townspeople watched in silence as the riders departed, their hoofbeats gradually fading into the distance. In their wake, they left a town forever changed, a community forced to confront the consequences of its cruelty and the possibility of redemption. Aiyana rode beside her brother, her grandmother's beadwork safely packed away, her dignity intact despite the morning's trials. She had come to town as a young woman seeking to trade. She was leaving as a symbol of her people's strength and grace, her song having reached far beyond the square, where it had been mocked. "Will he truly learn?" she asked Takoda as they rode toward home. "That depends on him," her brother replied. "We can show him truth, but we cannot force him to see it. That choice must come from within." Behind them, Copper Creek settled into an uneasy quiet, its people left to contemplate the events of the day and the lessons they had learned about respect, dignity, and the consequences of hatred. The 40 warriors had ridden away, but their message remained. That mockery of the sacred would not be tolerated, that dignity demanded respect, and that understanding between peoples was possible for those brave enough to seek it. In the days that followed, the story would spread across the territory, growing with each telling. Some would focus on the drama of the confrontation, others on the mercy shown by the warriors. But for those who had witnessed it firsthand, the true lesson was simpler and more profound, that in a world divided by fear and prejudice, the courage to understand one another remained humanity's greatest hope for peace.